Welcome to our podcast, This But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction about the Middle Ages. Today's episode, King Arthur, fact, fiction, and a lot of conjecture. Elle, we've talked about some pretty obscure subjects so far in this podcast.
Obscure? I'm sure all our readers know all about the epic poem Raoul of Cambrai and the transvestite knight Ulrich von Liechtenstein.
You mean listeners, not readers. That's what comes from being so bookish. And Ulrich was a costumed knight, not really a transvestite. I know you're just joking because I doubt if many of our listeners had ever heard of Raoul of Cambrai, and if they've heard of Ulrich von Liechtenstein, it was probably from the movie A Knight's Tale. But I'm sure that everyone has heard and knows something about the subject of this episode, King Arthur. And to talk about it, I've invited my longtime friend and colleague, Professor Jennifer Paxton, to join us. Some of you may know Jenny from her great courses videos about the Middle Ages and her many Smithsonian lectures. Jenny is director of the Catholic University's Honors Program and one of the very best historians of medieval England and Britain. Hi, Jenny, and welcome to Tis But a Scratch. King Arthur has been the subject of an enormous number of historical studies, novels, and movies. It's impossible to cover everything in a single episode, so we will devote 2 episodes to Arthur. This episode will be about the historical Arthur and whether there actually was a historical Arthur. And in a follow-up episode, we'll talk about the development of the Arthur of legend and literature. Let's begin with the most basic questions. Who was the historical Arthur, and did he even exist?
For this, we should begin with some background on the period in which Arthur may have lived, if he was a real person. That's the late stages of Roman rule in Britain and the beginnings of the Anglo-Saxon settlement, which is roughly the late 4th to the early 6th century.
And then we'll look at the evidence we have in favor of the historicity of Arthur. We'll do some detective work by looking at some key passages in early medieval texts, as well as archaeology and place name evidence, all in a bid to pull together every scrap of evidence we can that might give some historical validity to the existence of a person named Arthur and at the basis of the later stories about him.
Then we'll present the case that some historians make against the historical validity of Arthur. So Roman Britain had been tremendously prosperous. There had been a villa culture, particularly in the south and east, and the towns had been really quite Romanized.
It was also Christianized.
That's right, particularly in the towns, but there is evidence even that Christianity had penetrated into the countryside.
When I taught about the Roman Empire, Romanization, and the Pax Romana, what I would use in class is Tacitus's Life of Agricola, and then as a summary of what the Pax Romana meant, I would play this scene from Monty Python's Life of Brian, in which the People's Front of Judea and independence movement is asking that crucial question, what have the Romans ever done for us?
They bled us white, bastards. They'd taken everything we had. And not just from us, from our fathers, and from our fathers' fathers.
And from our fathers' fathers' fathers.
Yeah.
And from our fathers' 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 fathers.
All right, Stan, don't labour the point. And what have they ever given us in return?
The aqueduct?
What?
The aqueduct.
Oh, yeah, they did give us that. That's true, yeah.
And the sanitation.
Oh, yeah, the sanitation, Reg. Remember what the city used to be like?
Yeah, all right, I'll grant you, the aqueduct and sanitation are 2 things the Romans have done.
And the roads.
Well, yeah, obviously the roads. I mean, the roads go without saying, don't they? But apart from the sanitation, the aqueduct and the roads...
Irrigation. Medicine. Education.
Yeah, all right, fair enough.
And the wine.
Yeah, that's something we've really missed, Reg, if the Romans left.
Public baths.
And it's safe to walk in the streets at night now, Reg.
Yeah, they certainly know how to keep order. Let's face it, the only ones who could in a place like this.
All right, but apart from the sanitation, the medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation, roads, a fresh water system and public health, what have the Romans ever done for us?
Brought peace.
Oh, peace! Shut up!
That's a pretty good summary of how the Romans attempted to remake Britain into the province of Britannia, and a pretty good summary of the Pax Romana throughout the Roman Empire at its height.
They were aqueducts?
There are traces of about 60 aqueducts still extant in Britain. All this changed at the beginning of the 5th century as Britain became the poster child for the fall of the Roman Empire. There are probably multiple causes. For one thing, the direction of the economy was sharply downward. So how do we know this? Well, the archaeological record tells the tale. Previously, residents of Britain had access to manufactured goods from all over the Roman Empire, as Britain was integrated into the Roman economic system and trading network.
There is illustration in this in the changes in pottery. Roman Britain had been particularly active in the trade in pottery, as there were extensive ceramic manufacturing centers in southern Gaul, and the goods they produced were shipped up the Rhone River and then down the Seine, whence they were shipped to Britain. There were even pots from as far away as North Africa, which is another major center of ceramic production. But there was also local ceramic manufacturing in Britain that produced less high quality but still quite serviceable pottery, so people had a choice of price ranges. They could even buy different kinds of pots for different uses, the way a modern family might buy their everyday flatware from one source, their fine china from another. And this kind of market differentiation is really the sign of a thriving economy. But in the 4th century, we start to see a decline in manufacturing. And by the 5th century, trade from the continent has dried up, particularly in the south and east, which had previously been the region that was most open to trade with the rest of the empire. To give one vivid example of this decline, consider this. Wheel-thrown pottery was no longer widely available in Britain by the 5th century and would not be produced again there for hundreds of years. Instead, you get hand-shaped imitations of wheel-thrown pots. We also see signs that people were no longer producing and wearing new jewelry, and they were also scavenging for metal objects in abandoned building sites. This is not good. But the economic downturn did not occur in a vacuum. There was a political crisis at the same time.
Fall of Roman Britain is part of the larger story of the fall of the Roman Empire, and we should have scare quotes around fall. This is anything but a straightforward story. I would say transformation rather than fall.
That's fair.
The economic decline and de-Romanization of Britain in the 5th century through 7th centuries was more drastic and dramatic than, for example, in Visigothic Spain, Ostrogothic Italy, or even Frankish Gaul. Chris Wickham's framing of the early Middle Ages is a careful survey of the impact of the so-called fall of Rome upon different regions of the empire, and he doesn't draw any easy generalizations from this survey. The Eastern Empire, for example, what historians call the Byzantine Empire, but which was known as the Roman Empire throughout the Middle Ages, actually did better economically during the period than at the political height of the empire. The political and military disintegration of the empire used to be attributed solely to barbarian invasions. This is no longer the case. The barbarians who entered the Roman Empire in the late 4th and 5th centuries had long had economic, political, and military relations with the empire. Barbarians could be found in both the rank and file and the leadership of Roman armies. But these were only barbarians in the sense that they had Germanic ancestry. They spoke Latin and shared in Roman culture, and in the army they shared in a common Roman military culture. The Roman military had also long depended upon federate troops, essentially military forces, you might think of them as mercenaries, from allied barbarian tribes that fought under their own commanders but alongside Roman regulars. The Roman Magister Militum, master of the soldiers, Stilicho, commander-in-chief of the Roman army under the Emperor Theodosius I at the end of the 4th century, was the son of a Vandal cavalry officer. The ambition of the Visigothic barbarian king and federate commander Alaric, whom Stilicho alternately fought and supported, was to become the Magister Militum, the commander-in-chief in the west. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 was once seen as a major factor in the fall of Rome, as a conglomeration of Gothic tribes destroyed completely a Roman army. But the Emperor Valens, who fell in the battle, was responsible for the Goths being in the Balkans in the first place. These Germanic tribes were fleeing the really, really scary Huns and sought refuge within the borders of the Roman Empire. They were allowed to cross the Danube because Valens needed bodies for his armies and for workers on imperial estates. The Battle of Adrianople was the consequence of his officials' mismanagement and abuse of these refugees, and the defeat of the Romans was a consequence of really bad generalship. The context for Alaric's notorious sack of Rome in 410 was his attempt to force the Western Emperor Honorius to appoint him as commander of the Roman army in the West. He sacked Rome because his troops needed provisions and he needed treasures to pay them.
Now, the sack of Rome is highly symbolic, and it was traumatic for people like St. Augustine, but by then Rome was really no longer the capital of even the Western Empire. When Alaric troops were sacking Rome, Honorius was safely ensconced in his western capital, Ravenna.
Is that the reason why every time I say we really finally have to go visit Florence, you say, first we need to go to Ravenna?
I wanted to go to Ravenna as badly as Venice, if that's possible.
Oh, I want to go to Florence.
We can do that.
Okay. But a point I'd like to make here is that the biggest threat the Roman emperors faced in the 4th and 5th centuries was the same threat that they faced in the so-called 3rd century crisis. It didn't come from barbarian tribes intent upon destroying the Roman Empire. It came from ambitious Roman generals leading Roman and Federate troops in attempts to depose them. You can think of the so-called barbarian invasion as more like an immigration problem for the Roman Empire than an actual invasion.
True, but we can't discount the impact of the barbarians. Beginning in the 3rd century and continuing periodically through the 4th, the empire was attacked on multiple fronts, including in Britain, by raiders from northern and eastern Europe. In Britain, the biggest threat came along the southern and eastern coasts, leading the Roman authorities to build a series of forts. The coast where these forts were found later became known as the Saxon Shore, though historians are not sure whether this was because Saxons had been recruited as mercenaries to defend it, or because Saxons were the people the shore needed to be defended against.
Yeah, I like that.
There could be a little bit of retrospective branding going on here, because Saxons would later raid along the coast and then settle in Britain. Most of the time, the forts were adequate for repelling small nuisance raids, but the so-called barbarian conspiracy of 367 represented the most serious threat to Roman rule since Boudicca's revolt in 61 AD. In 367, Britain was attacked virtually simultaneously by 4 barbarian peoples: the Scotti from Ireland, the Picts from Scotland, and the Franks and Saxons from northwestern Europe.
I love the idea that the Scotti are from Ireland and not from Scotland.
It's a long story.
Yeah, I know.
We don't have time.
It's hard to grasp exactly how these various tribes were able to coordinate their activities, but somehow they must have done so, because the defensive resources, even of the heavily militarized province of Britain, were overwhelmed.
From this point on, contact between Britain and these Germanic peoples seems to have increased, although there are indications that there had been a Germanic presence in Britain already for a considerable period of time before the barbarian conspiracy. As Richard said, from the 3rd century on, Romans had begun enlisting Germans into the legions and hiring Federate troops as auxiliaries. There were Germans stationed in regions as far away as Egypt and Syria. This dynamic later caused more Germans to want to enter Roman territory. Word got back to their relatives back home. Something similar may have happened with German soldiers stationed with the Roman legions in Britain. The Roman Empire in the West, at least, was approaching its end, and its downfall was intimately connected to Britain.
In 383, a Roman general named Magnus Maximus rebelled against the Emperor Gratian and took several legions with him out of Britain to the continent to pursue his ultimately unsuccessful claim to the imperial throne. He was never replaced with a commander of equivalent stature. Progressively, Britain was being demilitarized, and as the situation for the Roman administration became increasingly desperate, Britain slipped farther and farther down on the priority list. But let's get rid of the Romans once and for all.
Okay.
The Britons seem to have wanted to do that.
They did.
That's at least the story told by an early 7th century Byzantine historian named Zosimus, who wrote that in the year 409, the Britons expelled the remaining Roman administrators. Apparently, the native elite wanted Roman military protection, but were not thrilled about paying Roman taxes in the absence of that military protection. There is some question whether the Roman Empire abandoned Britain or whether the Britons withdrew from the Roman Empire.
The details of the Roman withdrawal from Britain are murky, but I want to sketch them at least in outline because they provide an important indication of what things were like in the period when the people who came to be the Anglo-Saxons began to settle in Britain. And namely, this is a very unstable situation. At the very end of the year 406, a motley barbarian horde of Franks, Burgundians, and Vandals took advantage of an exceptionally cold winter, crossed the frozen Rhine, and rampaged throughout Gaul. In response, a Roman general in Britain named Constantius was raised to the purple as Constantine III and departed for Gaul, stripping the province of its legions in order to respond to the Frankish threat. In 410, the leaders of the Romano-British community, tired of being left defenseless, expelled the remaining officials of this usurping emperor. The British then appealed directly to the Emperor Honorius for help. They were initially met with silence. It turns out that 410 was not a good year to ask the Western Roman Emperor Honorius for help. It was the year of the famous sack of Rome by the Visigoths under their leader Alaric. Oh dear. And the situation did not improve from there.
Following year, 411, we have a curious text called the Rescript of Honorius, which tells the cities of Britain to look to their own defenses. They must have loved that. You're on your own, guys. There is a problem, however, with the source. The Rescript appears in the work of Zosimus, the same early 7th century Byzantine historian I previously mentioned. It occurs in the middle of his discussion of events in southern Italy, which has led some historians to believe that the Rescript was sent to Bruttium in the toe of Italy rather than to the province of Britain. The sources for this period can be maddeningly frustrating. If it did apply to Britain, then it was the last official communication that we know of between Britain and the Roman Empire. But regardless, we can be sure that the Roman Empire was disconnected from Britain from this point on, and it must have been very, very rough.
And this brings us to the most important sources for Romano-Britain, and the most problematic for the story of Arthur, a British cleric named Gildas. Gildas came from somewhere in Britain, we're not sure where, we're not very sure at all even of where he lived, but he's vital because he wrote the most vivid source about the period when Roman rule in Britain was ending, the period that later became associated with Arthur. It's a text called On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain. Whenever Gildas lived, he was probably writing about 100 years after the events he describes, and it's not clear what his sources are, but he records that the British authorities wrote to the Roman imperial government and begged for help. This appeal is dated to 446 to 454 AD, and it was addressed to the Roman general Flavius Aetius, the supreme commander in Gaul. According to Gildas, it read, To Aetius, thrice consul, the groans of the Britons.
Unlike the groans of the Ellen whenever I tell a pun. Don't mind us, Jenny. Just go on.
The barbarians drive us to the sea drives us to the barbarians. Between these two means of death, we are either killed or drowned. But there was no reply. This may have been because Flavius Aetius was in fact busy with the Huns. The British had terrible timing with these appeals.
They really did. If you look at old surveys of Roman and early medieval history or Western civ textbooks, you'll always find a map of the barbarian invasions of the Roman Empire with nice arrows coming in and all of that. In older surveys of Anglo-Saxon England, the map will be that of the Anglo-Saxon invasions by the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes from Jutland and northern Germany. The maps give us some big, broad, clear arrows that make it seem as if some kind of coordinated invasion took place at once.
I sense a but coming on.
Good call. And I'll let Jenny tell our listeners what that but is.
really, what we probably have is a long period of infiltration. When Germanic soldiers start serving in Britain, then they invite their relatives to join them, and so on, until their numbers become alarming. The Germanic migration was more like boiling the frog slowly, as the old saying goes, rather than a single cataclysmic event. But by the time Gildas was writing in the 6th century, it was pretty clear that the newcomers had taken over. That awareness probably affected the way he described these events. But what does he actually say? Gildas presents the Germanic migrants as a just punishment for the various sins of the British.
It's a Jeremiah.
It is. He tells us that the British authorities, who were now trying to cope in the absence of the Romans, initially invited Saxons into Britain as mercenaries to protect against northern raiders, continuing the practice the Romans had started when they established the forts along the Saxon shore. And this is what he says. Then all the councillors, together with that proud tyrant Vortigern, were so blinded that as a protection to their country, they sealed its doom by inviting in among them, like wolves into the sheepfold, the fierce and impious Saxons, a race hateful both to God and men, to repel the invasions of the northern nations. Now we need to put a little asterisk next to this guy Vortigern, because it's not clear if the name was actually inserted in the text later on. More on that to come. Then the newcomers grew dissatisfied with the reward they were receiving and became raiders themselves, spreading destruction throughout the island. Quote, "For the fire of vengeance spread from sea to sea and did not cease until it reached the other side of the island and dipped its red and savage tongue in the western ocean."
I love that.
Right? He does not hold back. This, I think, is where we get the idea that the Anglo-Saxons carried out a systematic slaughter of the British.
And Churchill repeated that as fact, which meant that it became in his popular history, and it sort of became dogma.
He was writing at a time where Germans were being demonized anyway.
Okay.
It's a story I learned in high school.
Yeah.
But, Gildas says, all was not lost. A war leader gathered the British together to resist.
Oh, thank God.
And his name starts with an A. It was Ambrosius Aurelianus.
Doesn't sound like Arthur.
It doesn't. Gildas describes him as, quote, a gentleman who, perhaps alone of the Romans, had survived the shock of this notable storm. Certainly his parents, who had worn the purple, were slain in it.
Sounds like Superman.
He does a bit. So who is this Ambrosius guy? Some scholars think that the reference to wearing the purple means that he came from a family with a military background, since Roman military officers in Britain would have worn tunics with a purple border. But purple was also worn by civilian officials, so he could just as easily have come from a family with a tradition of service in the government of the province of Britain. So they could have been bureaucrats. Yeah. One scholar, yes, right? One scholar has speculated that Ambrosius could have been related to one of the usurping emperors who sprang up in Britain in this chaotic period during the late 4th and early 5th centuries, before the Romans withdrew their forces from Britain altogether. But there could be a totally different explanation. Purple was also sometimes taken as a synonym for blood. So wearing the purple could have been a reference to Christian martyrdom, since he certainly seems to have come from a Christian background.
Okay.
Yeah, I like the story of them being officials best.
I think that's my favorite, too.
Yeah.
There's really no way at this point to verify who he was. But Gildas offers the intriguing detail that Ambrosius has relatives who were alive at the time that he is writing, though with his usual snark, he notes that they don't meet the standards that Ambrosius had set. This is what he says. His descendants now, in our times, have degenerated greatly from grandfatherly excellence. The fact that these relatives of Ambrosius are well known enough to be compared unfavorably with him would suggest that the family had been and remained prominent in post-Roman Britain. And I think this detail gives Gildas's story some plausibility, since he presumably would not claim this relationship if his readers were unlikely to find it credible.
That's a very strong piece of evidence.
I think so. Gildas tells us that Ambrosius mounted effective resistance against the invaders. He goes on to say that the struggle between natives and newcomers went back and forth until the Battle of Baden Hill, which took place 44 years after the arrival of the Saxons, at the time of Gildas's own birth. When he was writing, the time of warfare seems to have lain in the past, though, he says, the resulting damage has not yet been repaired. Quote, "And yet neither to this day are the cities of our country inhabited as before, but being forsaken and overthrown, still lie desolate, our foreign wars having ceased, but our civil troubles still remaining."
Yeah, here there is a slight archaeological problem. Archaeologists have turned up very little evidence for the devastation written by Gildas. The old Roman cities were abandoned, but they weren't sacked. The same is true for the Roman villas. In fact, there is little evidence for even a military invasion.
That's a point that Robin Fleming makes in her wonderful recent book, Britain After Rome, which is a material cultural history of early medieval Britain.
Yes, but I think that she may take it a bit too far. Much of the Adventus Saxorum, the coming of the Saxons, took the form of decades of peaceful migrations from the continent, but that peaceful migration followed a period in which native Romano-British chieftains invited in Germanic mercenaries from the continent, who then took advantage of the military weakness of their employers. Something has to explain the displacement of native Romano-British petty kings by Anglo-Saxon dynasties in the 5th and 6th centuries in the region that was to become the Kingdom of England.
I agree. I promise only 2 more Gildas quotations and we're done.
I was getting to love Gildas.
He is pretty fun. At first, he says, these sudden reversals of fortune for the British had a salutary effect on them. Quote, "For the remembrance of such a terrible desolation of the island, as also of the unexpected recovery of the same, remained in the minds of those who were eyewitnesses of the wonderful events of both, and in regard thereof, kings, public magistrates, and private persons, with priests and clergymen, did all and every one of them live orderly according to their several vocations."
Huh.
The problem is, says Gildas, that the salutary effect of the Saxon scourge had disappeared with the generation who had fought in the wars. Quote, "But when these had departed out of this world, and a new race succeeded, who were ignorant of this troublesome time, and had only experience of the present prosperity, all the laws of truth and justice were so shaken and subverted, that not so much as a vestige or remembrance of these virtues remained among the above-named orders of men, except among a very few." There is some evidence to suggest that sections of the elite attempted to organize resistance to the new arrivals, taking outright control in the early years, particularly in the cities where a Romano-British elite likely remained for a time, like London. However, according to Gildas, divisions within the elite in the struggle to control post-Roman Britain seem to have undermined these efforts. As England fragmented into petty kingdoms and warring factions, it seems the Britons were fighting against each other just as often as they were against the newcomers. And the cities, which were the centers of Roman Britain and the most likely places to be able to organize and resource a resistance, faced some of the most calamitous declines in the wake of the Roman withdrawal. Archaeological evidence shows that there was a drastically reduced activity in major Roman cities like London, Cirencester, and St. Albans as the 5th century progressed, suggesting rapid depopulation as the economy and trade collapsed.
I'd like to emphasize what Jenny just said. The decline of these Roman cities, which were situated on Roman roads and navigable rivers to facilitate trade as well as troop movement, were not because they were sacked and razed by Germanic barbarians. They were abandoned because their economic and political raison d'etre had disappeared along with the political and economic structures of the late Roman Empire.
That's pretty much all of the detail Gildas gives us about what happened. Now, he was not writing a historical text intended to provide these sorts of details. Rather, he was writing a sermon intended to get the rulers of his own day to behave better.
You know, what's interesting is that his Saxons play the role of a scourge of God who have come because of the sins of the British people. And the implicit threat is because of the decayed new generation that they're inviting God to send that scourge back.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the things that's always so interesting here is how a writer has to kind of figure out why God probably wanted this to happen.
Because God scourges those whom he loves. Letter to the Hebrews, chapter 12, verse 6. Or if you prefer an Old Testament take on it, Deuteronomy, chapter 8, verse 5. So know in your heart that just as a man disciplines his son, so the Lord your God disciplines you.
Right. Now, Gildas does leave some key gaps in the story. He does not explicitly say that Ambrosius himself was the victor at the Battle of Baden Hill. And since he describes a period of endemic warfare during which the Britons in general fought against the invaders, it could easily have been some other unnamed leader who won the battle. And we don't know where Mount Baden was, though many candidates have been proposed, none of which has any solid evidence behind it. But the story would grow in the telling.
The traditional narrative of the settlement of Britain by the Anglo-Saxons, based on written sources, sees a coordinated invasion by three distinct people, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, who carried out a deliberate military conquest. The more recent view, as we hinted a moment ago, is informed by archaeology and also by DNA studies, and it sees more a movement of settlers arriving piecemeal and becoming more and more numerous over time without any coordinated military confrontation, at least at first. It's likely, at least initially, that the true implications of the Germanic migrations were not immediately apparent. As noted, the Germanic migrants did not arrive en masse, nor did they necessarily have the common identity or gender. Rather, there were many waves of migration, both in large and small groups, and some of the migration had already occurred under the auspices of the Roman army, and some of it had come over even before because of economic reasons. Furthermore, Roman Britain has been thrown into disorder by the chaotic withdrawal of the Romans. A power vacuum has opened up, while the border defenses, like the Saxon shore built up by the Romans over decades, had rapidly fallen into disrepair or delinquency. Without centralized organization on the borders, migrants could arrive unopposed or unnoticed, and even if they were noticed, small bands of Germanic arrivals were likely low on the list of problems faced by a society whose economic and social structures had collapsed or were collapsing.
Could I ask a very basic question?
Sure.
You spoke of DNA.
Yeah.
In places where you have invasions, say in the islands to the north of Britain, you have to this day a major difference between male and female DNA, suggesting an honest-to-God invasion and conquest in which the men are killed and the women remained. Is it possible to make that kind of distinction for the early period of the Germanic arrivals?
Well, what you can do is you can say that modern DNA in Wales and in Western Scotland is much closer to the DNA that you see in Brittany and in Ireland. And that as you go further east, you have more associations with Germanic, Northern German DNA. But the question is, when did those migrants come in?
But it's also more than that. You have significant differences between male and female populations, because one suggests an honest-to-God invasion, while similar rates of representation of men and women suggest more peaceful infiltration.
Yeah, I agree.
Is it not possible to do that yet?
There are a number of studies that have come out recently that suggest there's a possibility that there is more male DNA than female DNA from the Germanic migrants. But it could have several different explanations, one of which is simply the male newcomers out competing native males for mates.
So you don't have the So in the absence of the complete replacement you see on some islands, you really can't draw those conclusions.
And you also have that situation in Iceland where genetic studies reveal that about 80% of the males have Norwegian DNA, while 62% of the females have Irish or British Isles DNA. One explanation is that the male settlers, the Vikings, apparently brought with them female slaves with whom they had offspring.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Okay, but while people were migrating in, others were migrating out. The most significant was to Armorica, which is an independent kingdom encompassing Brittany, today in France, and long a part of the Celtic world. A community of British descent was already extant there, as large numbers of British people in the Roman army had been settled there in the late 300s. Many more Romano-British moved to Brittany after the collapse of Roman authority in Britain, evidently judging their prospects to be better moving than by staying behind. And indeed, Gildas himself migrated to Brittany in his later life. Well, why does this matter for our purposes? Yes, because Brittany would later be a great incubator for stories about Arthur. Yes, we brought Arthur back in. It's time.
So what are we to make of Britain in the early 6th century? Rome had seemingly abandoned it. It was on the decline economically, its horizons had shrunk in every way, and it was increasingly subject to incursions from overseas. Some were warlike, others were fairly peaceful, but for the moment, the tide had been turned in favor of the British against the invaders. It is this period when the British had momentarily halted the Saxon advance, their one brief shining moment.
Stop! No singing. No.
I wouldn't do that to our listeners. I value them too much. Their one brief shining moment that has become associated with the figure known as Arthur.
Finally!
So let's now look at the case in favor of Arthur being the one who stemmed the Saxon tide, making him a hero ever after to the British people. Jenny, why don't you present the evidence for a historical Arthur?
A number of scholars have been associated with this case over the years, including Geoffrey Ashe, who wrote several books about the historical Arthur, and John Morris, who used Arthur's name to describe the entire period of British history from 350 to 650. They had no doubt of his existence. We can add Leslie Alcock, whose book Arthur's Britain similarly buries the lead. We know where he stands. It's interesting to note that while the original edition gives us a very real British landscape, the 2002 reissue, a quote-unquote classic history, provides us with a picture of a legendary Arthur with completely anachronistic armor and heraldry. But I'd like to focus on one particular scholar, Kenneth Hurlstone Jackson, who formulated what I think is the most cogent and careful case for the historical Arthur back in 1959. He started a famous article by asking, "Did King Arthur ever really exist? The only honest answer is, we do not know, but he may well have existed." So what led this cautious scholar to his tentative but largely positive conclusion? He starts his argument by examining the most securely dated texts we have about Arthur. These are the ones about which the fewest objections can be raised. This is because historians really like to know when things were written, because that gives us a sense of how likely the authors are to know what they're talking about. All other things being equal, we're going to trust something written closer to the time when it occurred over something written at a greater remove.
Not that that necessarily slows popular historians down.
Indeed. So what are these securely dated texts? First, we have an early 9th century text called the Historia Brittonum, or History of the Britons, traditionally attributed to a Welsh writer named Nennius, though for highly technical reasons scholars are no longer sure who really wrote the text, or if it was even compiled by a single author. But we're just going to call him Nennius for the sake of convenience. At least we have a very secure date for the text. It was definitely put together in 829 to 30. Nennius includes a much more elaborate version of the story about the coming of the Saxons to Britain than we get in Gildas. And while the details are clearly fantastical, it's worth bearing with them for what they reveal about the narrative that was taking shape on the British side about the early years after the fall of Rome. I'm not even going to try putting extensive quotes in here. I'm going to cut to the chase and say that Nennius does some streamlining to try to make the tale weave together a bit better. In Gildas's text, Vortigern, the guy who invites in the Saxons, and Ambrosius, the guy who beats them, we think, are discussed separately, in sequence, and given the vagueness of Gildas's chronology, it's not even clear that they were exact contemporaries. Nennius, for the first time, brings Vortigern and Ambrosius together. But Nennius is clearly working with conflicting traditions that may or may not refer to the same person. We learn that Vortigern ruled the Britons and feared Ambrosius as some sort of threat. We can bracket that for now. Nennius then describes the arrival of the Germanic mercenaries, but now they have acquired names. They are Hengist and Horsa,
whom Nennius undoubtedly found in Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People. The names Hengist and Horsa respectively means stallion and horse. Modern scholars have real doubts about the historicity of these two figures. Back to you, Jenny.
Vortigern has hired them to fight his enemies, the implication being that his enemies are internal rivals, not external invaders. So Nennius is blackening Vortigern's name here. We know that Nennius does not like Vortigern because he goes on to report that Vortigern committed incest with his own child.
Clear. That's a clear indication.
It really is. It's a value statement.
Yeah.
His wise men advise him to flee the shame by withdrawing into the western recesses of the kingdom, in what is now Wales, where he could build a fortress to keep him safe from his enemies. And I think this incest charge really is a kind of invented shorthand to say that Vortigern is not an admirable figure. But this passage is important because it has been taken as a very confused reference to the British rulers withdrawing westward in the face of the advancing Anglo-Saxons. And that is, in fact, the story that I learned in school.
Which is the story I learned in school.
Right. In extremely general terms, it probably does preserve a kernel of truth, in that the British ruling class probably did get squeezed out of their niches at the top of the hierarchy, and they moved westward over time, just probably not in one dramatic step. But Nennius gives us a second figure named Ambrosius, a mysterious child of uncertain parentage. Vortigern plans to sacrifice this child in order to ensure the strength of the fortress.
Another indication that he is not liked.
No, not a good guy. But the child then utters a mysterious prophecy that two dragons, one red and one white, will contend for the mastery of Britain. The white dragon represents the Saxons, and the red dragon represents the British. And this is the origin, of course, of the red dragon on the Welsh flag, which is, I think, the coolest flag in the world.
My vote goes to Sicily's three-legged Medusa.
This prophecy so frightens Vortigern that he cedes control of the south to Ambrosius and retreats to the north. What really worries Vortigern is that Ambrosius is revealed to be the son of a Roman consul, and there is thus a strong sense in which an exalted Roman background is still something to reckon with in this period. Some historians have speculated that this story contains, again, a kernel of truth, and that it might reflect a real division between the spheres of influence of two actual leaders.
One with a Celtic name and the other with a Latin name.
Right. But this is very, very speculative. And that is the last we hear of Ambrosius. And if you're confused, you are not alone. But it is going to get better from here.
I hope so.
Because the man of the hour has finally arrived.
Yay!
Yay! Nennius introduces a new character as leader of the resistance to the Saxons. Quote, "Then it was that the magnanimous Arthur, with all the kings and military force of Britain, fought against the Saxons. And though there were many more noble than himself, yet he was 12 times chosen their commander, and was as often conqueror." Note that Arthur is not called a king, but rather a dux bellorum, or leader of battles, rather than a king. And this is interesting, because Nennius does refer to all the kings of Britain, And he had called Vortigern, the guy who supposedly let the Anglo-Saxons into Britain, a king. So Arthur's not a king, he's just a particularly talented military commander.
So even if he existed, he didn't exist as King Arthur.
Not in Nennius's text. And it's worth stressing here that Nennius's text is the very first securely dated mention of a hero named Arthur in association with the coming of the Saxons.
300 years after.
Yeah, let's remember that. Nennius tells us that 12 battles took place between the Britons and the Anglo-Saxons and provides a list of which the Battle of Mount Badon is the last. This is the only battle that occurs in both Gildas and Nennius. Nennius says, the 12th battle was on Badon Hill, and in it 960 men fell in one day from a single charge of Arthur's, and no one laid them low, save he alone.
That sounds like history to me.
Absolutely. You will notice a key difference between the accounts of Gildas and Nennius, where Gildas has Ambrosius fighting the Battle of Mount Badon, possibly. Nennius has Arthur.
And fighting it pretty much alone.
Right. So this text in Nennius is the heart of the case for the historical Arthur. The proponents of Arthur all pretty much concede that Arthur, if he existed, was a war leader rather than a king, and they argue that the historical context we've just been describing would certainly have lent itself to someone who could do what Arthur is said to have done, which is beat the Saxons in battle multiple times. But what are we to make of this list of battles, given that only one of them also appears in Gildas?
Yeah.
Right. So let's go back to our pro-Arthur scholar, Kenneth Jackson. Jackson made a valiant attempt to fit all 12 battles within an appropriate chronological framework. But even Jackson concedes that the battles on the list cannot have all been fought by Arthur, since some of them seem to reflect historical battles we know of that were widely separated in time, and others seem to have been entirely invented. So the historical Arthur camp does not rest its case too much on the details of the battles. The general thrust is that the British fought back, and Jackson is satisfied that even if the details of the battles are not literally true, there is a kernel of truth behind the idea that somebody named Arthur fought against the Saxons and was successful. And we're done with Nennius for now, you will be relieved to hear. Richard, how about you take over? Tell our listeners about the Annales Cambriae.
The Annals of Wales. The Annales Cambriae, or Annals of Wales, date from the 10th century.
So now we're up to 4 centuries after the historical Arthur was supposed to have lived. This is a primary source?
We early medievalists have a very, very wide view of primary sources. It isn't a primary source, but those who use it to establish a historical author would say that this 10th century text includes earlier materials, which is true for a lot of medieval chronicles.
But how do they know that it included anything other than Nennius? Never mind.
Because it provides a tiny bit of information not found in Nennius.
Okay.
So here's what the text says about Arthur. Under the entry for 516 AD, we have, quote, the Battle of Badon, in which Arthur carried the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ on his shoulders for 3 days and 3 nights, and the Britons were victors. Under 537 AD, we get, quote, the strife of Camlon, in which Arthur and Mordred fell, and there was death in Britain and in Ireland, end quote. You'll notice immediately that there is some overlap between Nennius and the Annales Cambriae, since both texts attribute the victory at Mount Badon to Arthur. However, this is the first time we get any mention of a character named Medrel or Mordred, and the first time we see any mention of a battle in which Arthur died. Note that we cannot tell in this entry for 537 who the enemy was, nor is there any clear implication that Mordred was Arthur's opponent, let alone his son, as he would later become when tradition developed further. There is, of course, also a discrepancy between Nennius and the Annales Cambriae about where Arthur carried the image of the Virgin Mary.
But I thought he was carrying a cross on the shoulders.
Well, the pro-Arthur scholars have an explanation for this.
Okay.
The Old Welsh words for shoulder and shield are extremely similar, and the theory is that the tradition probably got garbled along the way in oral transmission in Old Welsh before being recorded in Latin by Nennius and the Annales Cambriae.
Talk about grasping at straws, but okay.
Right, so that's not much of a chink in the armor of the historical Arthur.
Not anything like Arthur solely killing 960 men with a rush, as Nennius has him do.
Okay.
Or that the battle lasted for 3 days, which is 2.5 days longer than any battle that I can think of in the Middle Ages.
So far, we've got these two securely dated texts that seem to put Arthur at the center of the struggle we see in Gildas to beat back the Anglo-Saxons. What else have we got?
Well, we've got the Gododin.
Yes, the Gododin. We have a text that we cannot date as surely as we can the first two texts I've talked about.
Or at all.
At all.
Right? But it's very intriguing because it might contain the earliest reference to Arthur. It could be much earlier than either Nennius or the Annales Cambriae.
Please note the words might and could.
Very much so. The Gododin is a poem set around the year 600. It's written in an early form of Welsh, which derived from the common Brittonic language spoken everywhere in Britain in various dialects. The poem describes a raid by a British tribe in southern Scotland called the Gododin on the fortress of Catrife or Catterick in Yorkshire, possibly, although we're really not even sure about that. At that time, this would have been held by an Anglian dynasty, that is, a dynasty of Germanic-speaking newcomers. And the Angles give us the first part of the term Anglo-Saxon. Yeah. The hero of the poem is named Gwardir. The poet has plenty of nice things to say about Gwardir, but we do get this rather ambivalent compliment. Quote, "He fed black ravens on the rampart of a fortress, though he was no Arthur." Now, of course, to feed black ravens means to kill warriors who are then going to become food for carrion birds. That's what it means to feed the ravens. But this guy Gwardir is clearly not quite up to the standards that some other guy named Arthur set. Yeah, not bad Gwardir, but I've seen better. The argument made by Jackson and other supporters of the historical Arthur is that a throwaway comment like this, a reference that people were just supposed to get, could only refer to someone whom everyone recognized as a standard of military excellence. It would be like saying that a general today was pretty good, but no General Patton, or that a basketball player was pretty good, but no Michael Jordan. Now, if this is the earliest possible written source for Arthur, it comes from about a century after his lifetime, which would have been perhaps just barely within the living memory of what people could have told their children they had seen when they were young. Still, it provides no details whatsoever, just the bare name.
This problem comes from the insecurely dated part. The manuscript in which the reference is contained dates from much later, from the later 13th century. Now, the text is probably much older than this, and the reason that we say that is because linguists tell us that the language in the text is an archaic language. This is sort of like the English of Shakespeare or the King James Bible, and that tells us that these are centuries old. But they can't pin the poem down any more securely than from the 7th to the 11th centuries, and there is some evidence that the author reference itself may be a later interpolation. That is, the line may have been added in later when Arthur had already become this legendary figure. Jackson, ever the careful scholar, concedes that this is a concern. Now, this does not necessarily mean that the story of Arthur did not exist at the time the poem was first written down. The omission could have been a mistake that was being rectified later, so the reference to Arthur could be evidence for the early existence of stories about Arthur, or it could be that the story of Arthur grew up later and someone wanted to go back to this text after the fact and make it clear that this hero was not on par with the legendary Arthur. We can't be sure which. So this is probably not the strongest plank in the pro-Arthur case, but it's perhaps strengthened by another intriguing bit of evidence for the existence of a historical author runs along quite similar lines to what I've just been saying about the Godolphin, namely that we might have evidence that someone named Arthur was widely known around Britain and even in Ireland during the late 6th century, when we suddenly get a cluster of people named Arthur showing up when the name had not been widespread before.
Okay, it makes sense to spend a few minutes talking about the name Arthur. It looks kind of Celtic, but it's actually not directly Celtic in origin. It comes from the Latin Artorius. And I say not directly because I gather that it's possible the name was borrowed from Celtic in the distant past when Celtic was being spoken on the European continent near Latin speakers. It may mean something like son of a bear, and it's obviously intended as a name of power. Now, the historical Arthur proponents have noted that in the 6th century and into the 7th, you get the sudden appearance of prominent people with the name Arthur, and then it drops off like it's a fad that came and went. And they're important leaders from Ireland, Wales, and Scotland. The idea is they were all named after this super famous guy from around 500. The way you have a lot of people named after George Washington after the American Revolution.
This is very much like the Godolphin argument. The name Arthur is out there, it's one to conjure with. In contrast to the securely dated text part of the argument, this is really a bit of the no smoke without fire part of the argument. Most of the scholars who believe in Arthur agree on most of what I've said so far, but when we finish with the texts and move on to archaeology and place name evidence, we hit disagreements. One of the strongest disagreements has been over geography. Where was Arthur active? Broadly speaking, we can divide the schools of thought into the northern hypothesis and the southern hypothesis. Those who believe that Arthur was active in the north point to the fact that the texts I've just talked about, Nennius, the Annales Cambriae, and the Godolphin, are northern in origin. Those who believe in the southern hypothesis place a great deal of emphasis on the Arthurian associations that were recorded for place names in Wales and Cornwall. There are place names in both regions that are associated with Arthur. How to choose between these two possibilities? It's not really possible. In the absence of texts, all that archaeology can really do is indicate what kind of activity was taking place at approximately what date. It can't say who precisely was there doing what. And while we're on the subject, I'll just mention the most famous Arthurian site of all, Tintagel.
Which is featured in the most recent issue of the Smithsonian Magazine in an article called, Was Arthur a Real Person?
I just read that article. According to the most influential medieval version of the Arthur tale by Geoffrey of Monmouth, about which much more to come,
Yes.
Tintagel was the site where Arthur was begotten. Now, Tintagel really was inhabited at around the right time, and it was a major center of lordship. But again, we don't have any proof that Arthur was actually here. And incidentally, there is actually a remains of a hill fort on the site of Tintagel, and nearby there is a hotel built at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries specifically to cash in on the wave of Arthurian interest during the Victorian period.
Yeah.
If you look at the surrounding area, too, you can see that the branding has continued. My personal favorite is a place called Merlin's Cave.
Where he was imprisoned.
Oh, absolutely. You can find these features all over the place, and in many cases it's hard to tell how long these names have been around. So I've been poking a little fun at the place name evidence here, but mostly to say that it is part of the case for historical Arthur, but even the pro-Arthur scholars don't regard it as the strongest part, except, again, as part of the general no smoke without fire aspect of the argument. There are a lot of leaps of faith in this.
Yeah.
The final aspect of the pro-Arthur case is the fact that we do have a few scattered references to Arthur in Welsh and Breton texts from the 7th to the 11th centuries, and at least one extended tale in Welsh prose that features Arthur. These texts characterize him as a heroic warrior and protector of Britain, fighting both real enemies, such as the Saxons, but also supernatural ones. many of the references we have are vague allusions that assume the reader would be readily acquainted with the name, which again suggests that the Arthur character had already become a well-known folk hero by this point. You're going to get a huge development in the myth of Arthur in 1138, when Geoffrey of Monmouth writes his History of the Kings of Britain, which really jump-starts the literary craze for Arthur. The pro-Arthur scholars are aware that anything dated to a period later than Geoffrey runs the risk of having been quote-unquote contaminated by Geoffrey. That is, maybe it's not an independent witness. Maybe it just comes from Geoffrey. So these pro-Arthur scholars are particularly looking for texts that come before that.
What about Glastonbury? I mean, isn't that is there a primary source buried in the stories on Glastonbury?
It's a primary tourist stop for Arthurian tours.
Yes, and the 12th century monks of Glastonbury would be very proud of that. The craze for Arthur became so widespread in the 12th century that the famous monastery of Glastonbury decided to cash in on it. During the later years of Henry II's reign, the monks of Glastonbury claimed that they had discovered the bodies of Arthur and Guinevere. The site of the excavation of these graves is commemorated to this day at the ruins of Glastonbury Abbey, but the wording of the sign carefully refuses to take a position with regard to the authenticity of the remains. Stories about King Arthur became so popular that they were the subject of this rather transparent and infamous hoax. The curious flocked to Glastonbury to check this out. Such fortuitous discoveries of burials were the stock in trade of stories about saints, since possession of the relics of saints helped promote a church in the fierce competition for medieval pilgrims. But it was unusual for the body or bodies discovered to belong to a secular ruler whom nobody claimed had been a saint. Now, so far, I've been making the mainstream historical Arthur case, the one that takes Nennius and the Annales Cambriae at their word that Arthur was the victor of the Battle of Mount Badon, thus making him a British war leader from around the year 500. But it turns out that there are other possible candidates for who Arthur might have been. Well, say scholars who still believe that Arthur was a real person, who else could he have been? Where did all that smoke come from with all of those place names and other references in the Godothan and elsewhere? It's time to meet the other possible Arthurs. The first one is a guy named Lucius Artorius Castus, who was a Roman military commander in the 2nd or 3rd centuries AD, who served in Britain at one time and later died in Croatia, where he had an inscription erected in his honor.
It's a little early, isn't it?
Right?
A lot early.
Supposedly, he commanded a group of cavalry who were originally from the Scythian steppes, specifically from Sarmatia.
Which made them knights.
It's a bit of a stretch, honestly, since the details of his career don't really fit the stories at all. I think the people who have gone for this one have mostly been intrigued by the name.
Artorius Castus is the hero of a 2004 movie directed by Antoine Fuqua called King Arthur, in which there is no King Arthur. He is represented as a Romano-British commander of a Sarmatian Federate mounted troop who are given the mission of rescuing a noble Roman family living north of Hadrian's Wall before they're killed by the savage Saxons who are marching south. The only thing historical about this movie is that it is set on the eve of the Roman military departure from Britain in 407, but to do this, the screenplay writer, Antoine Fuqua, had to place Artorius Castus about a century to 2 centuries later than he actually lived. I think of this movie as Saving Private Marius.
We kind of have the opposite problem with our second Arthurian candidate, a Romano-British leader named Riothamus. Geoffrey Ashe is a fan of this theory. The career of Riothamus might be a better match for the stories. He was active around 460 to 470 AD, and the 6th century Gothic historian Jordanes does call him king of the Britons. Supposedly, he answered a summons by the Emperor Anthemius to fight the Burgundians in Gaul, and later legends do have Arthur crossing over to fight in Gaul. But he might have been referring not to Britain the island, but to Brittany the province that had recently been settled by migrants from Britain. Really, they should have come up with a more distinctive name for Brittany. It really caused problems throughout the Middle Ages. And the other big problem is the name, of course. He is not named Arthur. How does Ash get around this? The theory is that Riophamus is not his actual name, but more of a title meaning High King. His real name maybe was Arthur. Might have been, I think, is the operative expression, right? It could have been Fred. I don't think there's a lot to this theory. Finally, there is the notion that has probably occurred to many of us. Maybe Arthur is just the guy whom Gildas named all along, Ambrosius Aurelianus. I mean, he's right there in the text, and his name does start with A, right? The problem is that no linguistic sleight of hand has been able to make the name Arthur derive from Ambrosius or Aurelianus. So that's not really an answer. So let's sum up.
So we have securely dated mentions of Arthur in a 9th century text, the Historia Britonum, and a 10th century text, the Annales Cambriae. We have a mention of Arthur that we can't date securely, but could be from 600, but maybe not. We have a sudden spate of known people named Arthur in the century after he's supposed to have lived. We have lots and lots of folkloric evidence of places associated with Arthur at various places in the Brittonic-speaking world, and we have folktales about Arthur. Those who believe in an historical Arthur would argue that there is no smoke without fire, and it must add up to a real person somewhere.
Recent scholarship on the historicity of Arthur is a lot more skeptical. It ranges from agnosticism to outright atheism. Inverting Jackson's famous formulation, one recent scholar, O.J. Padell, stated, Arthur may very well not have existed. The most prominent Arthur skeptic is David N. Dumville, professor emeritus at the University of Aberdeen. Dumville's area of expertise is early Anglo-Saxon England, and he's responsible for some of the most important scholarly work on the sources for this period. He began his anti-Arthurian crusade in the 1970s at what was probably the height of the historical Arthur moment. Typical is his historical assessment of the value of the Historia Britonum. Quote, in general, our ignorance of the political history of the British 5th century is almost total. In my view, it is not legitimate to seek to lighten this darkness by the use of unhistorical sources offered by a writer whose ignorance was complete and whose concept of history did not require him to distinguish between certain types of evidence, as we must do. We must seek alternative testimony which will introduce us to other areas of 5th century culture. For example, archaeology. Dumville's views on the subject of Arthur are summed up in an article published in 1977, Sub-Roman Britain, History and Legend. Taking direct aim at John Morris's massive The Age of Arthur and Leslie Alcott's Arthur's Britain, Dumville admonished, quote, I think we can dispose of Arthur quite briefly. He owes his place in our history books to a no smoke without fire school of thought. What evidence is there for his existence? The totality of the evidence, and it is remarkably slight until a very late date, shows Arthur as a figure of legend, or even, as Sir John Rees pointed out last century, of mythology. The fact of the matter is that there is no historical evidence about Arthur. We must reject him from our histories and above all from the titles of our books. End quote. The basic argument against the historical Arthur is that he is not mentioned in the one attested primary source for the so-called Age of Arthur, Gildas's Destruction of Britain. Where we should find Arthur, we get instead some guy named Ambrosius. As Jenny pointed out, the only thing that the names Ambrosius and Arthur have in common is that they begin with A. The pro-Arthur advocates have tried their best to get around this. One common argument is that Gildas was writing a sermon, not a historical text. Well, it's certainly true that he was trying to get his contemporaries to stop sinning, but it's a pretty historical sermon. And why name Ambrosius Aurelianus and not Arthur? Kenneth Jackson's explanation is that Gildas would not have needed to say that Arthur won the Battle of Badon because everybody knew that. It would be like pointing out in, say, 1850 that the Battle of Waterloo had been won by the Duke of Wellington. But I really can't imagine an English author writing in 1850 about Waterloo and not mentioning Wellington. Arthur is also absent from the most important narrative source for early Anglo-Saxon England, Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, written in 731 AD. Following Gildas, Bede presents Ambrosius Aurelianus as the great British resistance leader and victor of the Battle of Badon. It's certain that Bede's main source for this period is Gildas, but if Arthur was so famous in northern Britain that a century after Bede, his heroic feats were celebrated by Nennius, it's odd that Bede had heard nothing of him. When it comes down to it, the only source for a historical author is one line in the Godothin, a poem preserved in a late 13th century manuscript that may be as early as the 7th century or as late as the 11th, and this one line may well be an interpolation. The anti-Arthurian scholars at this point tend to regard the search for the historical author as a big distraction from two important scholarly goals. First, figuring out what really happened during the centuries after the fall of Rome and Britain, and second, figuring out how the myth of King Arthur developed as a literary phenomenon. So you'll find both historians and literary scholars in the anti-historical author camp. The foremost scholar of early medieval Wales, Thomas Charles Edwards, offers, I think, a very reasonable compromise. Quote, "At this stage of the inquiry, one can only say that there may well have been a historical author, but the historian can as yet say nothing of value about him." We've run out of time. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you had as much fun as we did.
I definitely did.
Bye for now, and in a few weeks, Ellen, Jenny, and I will be back to talk about the development of the legend of King Arthur. Hope you can join us then.